Convicted rapist Bob Hewitt's release on parole has been suspended. In 2015, the tennis star was convicted for the rape of 2 young women and sexually assaulting another. His parole will now be referred to the review or for the board, rather, to review that decision. Now, the Department of Justice and Correctional Services spokesperson Crispin Phiri joins us in studio now. Mr. Phiri, thank you very much for your time. Firstly, I've got to ask you, were the survivors of Mr. Hewitt's crimes consulted before this decision was taken?
I think it's important, firstly, to place on the record that the Correctional Services Parole Board is independent, and it makes its decisions independent of the political principles and the national department. And in this case, a decision was made to grant Mr. Hewitt parole after he had qualified for parole. But as we understand it, we have received confirmation that the relevant procedure was not followed. And in this case, that is actually consulting the victims of...
If relevant procedure was not consulted, what does that mean exactly?
It means that the decision can be placed under review, and that's exactly what the minister has done.
And the consequences for not following the procedure by the parole board?
The Act allows you to actually review any decision that is made by the parole board for any other factor. And the effect of that is that that decision then can be rendered invalid.
Is this parole board, Mr. Crispin, is this parole board fit to actually carry out its duties? Because this is a complete disregard for the victims who suffered at the hands of Mr. Hewitt.
That is an assessment that will have to be made over the course of the couple of months that we can review this decision. I mean, maybe there are other decisions as well which can be punished. You would know that every correctional facility has a parole board. So there are a number of parole boards across the country making similar decisions. And I think this then really gives us an opportunity to put in a micro lens on these decisions and really assess whether they are following the correct procedures. Especially in this case, one of the things that the Minister of Justice has said is that our justice system across the entire spectrum needs to be victim-centric, meaning that you need to be sensitive to the plight of the victims. And in this case, it is legislated that you actually have to consult a victim in the event that you want to release someone on parole. So
but as you will know, and I'm sorry to cut in, but as you will know, the families, and in particular the victims of Mr. Hewitt's crimes here, they state very clearly that the only time that they were consulted was when Mr. Hewitt was being considered for parole. At which point do they come into this whole decision-making process?
That's one of the things that the minister actually has lamented about the system as a whole. You would imagine that, say, someone has been convicted for 10 years, and you hardly hear of this person, and the only time you now hear about them is the fact that they are being granted parole. That must be secondary victimization in its truest form. And that's something that the minister has said right across the spectrum, even whilst the person is being rehabilitated in our facilities. Somehow we should ensure that the victims are kept abreast about the progress of this rehabilitation. But in this instance, when granting parole, it happens whilst they're considering the decision. The victim would then be granted an opportunity to make representations to the parole board so that they can be able to assess for themselves as well whether the offender has been rehabilitated, because you'd find in some instance the offender may not be sufficiently rehabilitated, and the victim would be able to say that I don't think this offender actually understands the harm that he has caused, and I don't think he's ready for parole. And that should happen in due course, and that should happen as a course of legislation as well.
Crispin Phiri, thank you very much for making the time to speak to us. He speaks for